This is an excellent question in how you formatted it, so bravo to you. Can someone please explain why medical mask mandate for all, okay, universal masking, would not be considered an appropriate accommodation under the ADA? There is such diversity in needs and a plethora of communication needs in special education and beyond, learning to read, English language learners, neurodiverse learners, hearing impaired, non-speaking students, etc. The question of not having to wear a mask as ADA accommodation is understood, but does not honestly cover all those losing education under conditions of a mandate. Okay, let's go ahead and tackle the universal masking and why that wouldn't be considered an appropriate accommodation under the ADA. And look, within my field, I'm going to go ahead and let all of you know that I am absolutely in the minority among civil rights attorneys that focus on special education and disability rights law when it comes to public education. Acknowledge that. Don't care. They're wrong. I'm right. I do not believe that this is the time to be using disability rights in the wrong way. This is a temporary emergency. Anything that you're playing with right now can and will be used against you in the future. Absolutely. You give the schools any more authority, it will come back to bite you and your children. If not your children, grandchildren. And who am I going to blame? I'm going to blame all of you that could not see the forest through the trees. There are plenty of examples just in the last 25 years to where we have given up ground and rights. It's called mission creep, guys. If you don't sit there and box government in clearly defined parameters, then it will sit there like a blob and just continue to run over its banks like the Mississippi, over a levee. And it will flood and destroy everything in its path because that is what government does. That is why we have very specific rules in disability rights and under the IDEA to keep government in check. To keep the government in check. The entire point we have the 504, the ADA, and the IDEA is because of government abuse, historical government abuse. And one of the biggest forms of abuse is apathy, guys. How apathetic they've been toward our children. They just exist. In the past, we don't even want them in school. In the past, we'll put them in the woods. We have this big, huge building there and where we stick them all and we just pretend they didn't exist. They do ghost hunter shows now in those locations in the woods that we all pretended didn't exist in the 50s and 60s and 70s. We have made a lot of progress as a society, and we are absolutely losing our minds right now under this COVID thing, to where there are actual attorneys like myself making arguments that somehow embedded within the ADA and the IDEA and 504 that there's authority to universally mask children. Now, the question, can someone please explain why a medical mask mandate for all would not be considered an appropriate accommodation under the ADA? Because the entire standard under 504, IDEA, and the ADA is reasonable. It is a reasonable accommodation. There are times to where we've had to sit there and do a tour around a school on whether or not they are required to retrofit their school for one of my clients that was a quadriplegic, that was transitioning from the junior high to the high school. Now, what did we have to do? The reasonableness standard had to do with money and costs. And we had to sit there and determine the age of the building because it's different. They're not a Walmart. They're a government building, and government takes care of government, guys. So there's always a different standard for a government, just like under these stupid mandates. Vaccines, for example, the president wants everybody to do it, right? Well, except for judges and their staff, they're exempt. Congress, they're exempt along with their staff. Postal Service is exempt. Look it up. You don't believe me. So how is it that it's a mandate for everybody, but not for the special people that work inside government? Some sections of government. It's the same standard. We sit there and we have to walk around a school, but then we have to apply sort of the rules for accommodation of when that building was constructed, not current policy. Then we have to sit there and look to determine whether or not an alternative exists for the child, meaning another high school. If there's not another high school, then we have to sit there and do some more analysis on what might need to be done. And I had one, I've had a couple to where we just had to sit there and move the child to a different high school in the bigger city that did have reasonable accommodations to where the child could navigate the school without any kind of excessive cost burdened or shifted over to the school system to retrofit the one that the child was zoned for. Reasonableness standard. Now, is that necessarily fair to my client? Not necessarily fair, but it wasn't equitable. Yes, in the term of reasonableness, because what they have a right to was that equal access. Well, they have it provided at this alternative school. Whether I agree with it or not, that's the standard. But I did have a small rural school to where that was the only high school. And yes, they had to sit there and retrofit a bathroom that had electronic opener. They had to construct a bathroom just for him that went all the way to the floor, all the way to the top, and that he had a key to. So that somebody could, so that the equipment, his equipment was there in that bathroom. So it was his bathroom. They had to put a covered walkway between one building to another building because it rained a lot in South Alabama with lightning. So there were things that, yes, the schools are required to do in situations to where that's reasonable. But what is that reasonable standard? And so this entire thing on masking, it is about reasonableness. Is it reasonable? That is why every one of these mandates carry exceptions and exemptions that don't just apply to kids with special needs or disabilities. It can apply to a bunch of kids. What are the three standards? Well, number one is religious. That's a constitutional right. One that we're born with from birth, because there's a separation of church and state. Now, you don't want church inserted into your schools, most of you, right? Well, I also don't want government inserting itself into religion to sit there and tell people what they can or cannot believe. All right, so religious exemption should be the no-brainer on masks. The second thing is conscientious objection. I believe that that should be included. I know some of you don't. Oh, I just don't agree with that. I don't care what you agree with. Look around. Nothing happens if you get offended and you're bothered by it. But that should be an option. Okay? And the third one is medical exemption. But see, this person brings up a very good point. It's not necessarily a medical exemption or a medical need for children that are learning to read, English language learners, neurodiverse learners, the hearing impaired, non-speaking students that rely upon visualization of the mouth. Those kind of things, we were having those discussions last year, guys. We were, because I had cases like that. To where people were, I need to wear a mask. Okay, but my students need to see your lips. How are we going to work on that? And that's reasonable accommodations. And if you as a teacher don't feel comfortable with that, fine. The school has a responsibility to bring somebody in that can. And I believe that that's where the advent of the face shield came in and stuff like that. But it seems like we've gotten crazier this school year. And I know that people are all been out of shape, but I knew that this school year was going to be worse because of the changes that the CDC made with regards to contact tracing. And I did a video about it. And I explained it all and I walked you through it. Because of the changes with contact tracing, they're making it look worse with regards to this school year, because your data will track whatever your points are. So if your data is only tracking this, then that's exactly what your data points are going to show. So for example, if the kids that you're sending home are the unvaccinated kids, and that's 12 and under, or older kids that have chosen not to, or staff that have chosen not to, well, they get sent home and quarantined, and they get shown or marked in a different way. If you've had the vaccine, or let's say you're wearing a mask, then the rules are different for you, even though there is absolutely breakthrough infections. Vaccinated people are getting it. Vaccinated people are being hospitalized, but yet they don't have to quarantine in the same way that those declared unvaccinated have to quarantine. Do you see? So so the data points on those things is not very reliable because of how they defined the tracking of that data. And I don't agree with that. So there's not a lot of consistency. So once again, at the end of the day, this is about reasonableness. The entire standard and consideration should be reasonable. And that's what we need to focus on. That's what you need to think about. Now, do I have clients that need to be masked? Absolutely, I do. And I will work my tail off to identify a set of solutions that work for them so that they can receive tangible services. I don't think it's fair for them or equitable to say, well, you need to stay home. We can find an alternative that works. Is the answer universal masking and putting other kids in masks just because, 5 kids need everybody to wear a mask? No, that's not reasonable. That is not reasonable. And I will not jump on a political movement, because that's what that is. It's a political movement. None of those states that have, like Texas and Florida, for example, none of those states said that you can't send your child in a mask. They're just saying that you can't make it universal to where everybody has to wear one. And quite frankly, the governors that are correct are the ones in the red states that are leaving. That's reasonable. They're not prohibiting schools from allowing kids and staff to wear masks. The unreasonable states are the ones that are pushing for universal masking because they're not acknowledging the need. Now, they may have exemption policies, but they're making parents jump through all these additional hoops to sit there and prove something that, quite frankly, they shouldn't have to prove. That is a terrific point. What about kids that are learning to read, that need to see the mouth, eyes, mouth? They need to see those things. That's not necessarily a disability, guys. Those are just children learning to communicate and learning to read. Very critical. Kids with social emotional need. I could sit there and go down that it's not necessarily a disability, guys. It's just us being human. These things are damaging. The standard is reasonable. The standard is reasonable. That's our standard. I don't want to lose that ground, guys. I don't want to change the definition of what reasonableness is. Because like I said, what you're asking, those of you who want this stuff, what you're asking is for the government to get more power, the school to have more power to determine what everybody should be doing, thus moving the goalposts again. as to what reasonableness is. And do you understand that that can be used against you? Once all this is done, remember the Patriot Act and all the stuff that we gave up after 9/11? All of the web of surveillance. Now it's being used against us. Remember, they promised that was never going to happen? Well, that's exactly what's happening. Now it's being used against us. The government just didn't say, oh, we're just going to give all this freedom back. No, we gave it up. They found other ways to use it. That's what happens. Once again, mission creep. There's a reason and a purpose behind clearly defining the parameters of government. The standard of what your child requires revolves around reasonableness. Also the standard of what other people's children, reasonableness.